This is an exploration of the social, historical and cultural context of An Inspector Calls. This nugget will focus on the two important years, 1912 and 1945. An Inspector Calls was written in 1945 but set in 1912. This means that the characters are supposed to exist 33 years before the audience. Between these 2 years, a lot changed in Britain. While the Burlings are comfortable in 1912 society, they are an example of the sort of family that would have struggled due to the events leading up to 1945. Priestley wants the audience to see how far society has come, but also how far they still have yet to go in achieving equality. An important point about context is that while in 1912 the inspector's views would be seen as controversial or something a lot of people disagreed with, in 1945 public opinion was very different. There was a call for change and people were ready to live in a fairer and more equal society. A 1945 audience would largely be on the inspector's side. Let's look at a brief overview of the historical events between 1912 and 1945, each of which help us to understand the play in greater depth. In 1912, just 2 weeks after Sheila and Gerald's engagement party and the inspector's interrogation, the Titanic sinks. The ship is referenced by Arthur in the play, as its maiden voyage was considered an important advancement in engineering. In 1914, 2 years after the play is set, Britain joins the First World War and the lives of Britons is changed. In 1917, a Russian Communist Party called the Bolsheviks overthrow the Tsar and take control of Russia, sparking a civil war to last 5 years. In 1918, World War I ends with Britain on the winning side. In this year, the Representation of the People Act is also passed. This means that men of all backgrounds and some women were awarded the vote. This meant that people who had previously never had a say could now have some influence over who led them. In 1926, 1.7 million workers went on a general strike due to low wages and poor working conditions, among other reasons. The strike lasted 9 days and showed the impact that the disillusioned working classes could have in society. In 1929, New York's Wall Street crash, the plummeting of stock prices, caused a worldwide depression. This meant that people all over the world, and of working and middle class, suffered unemployment and low wages. Finally, in 1939, Britain joins the Second World War. This war lasted until the play was first performed in 1945. The two world wars are incredibly important to understanding the play properly. In 1914, Britain began the fight against Germany in World War I. The war lasted 4 years and an estimated 700,000 British soldiers lost their lives. The two sides consisted of the Allies, Britain, France and Russia, and the General Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and was fought over territory. Many people in the 1945 audience of An Inspector Calls would remember the Great War, as they named it, and some would have fought in it. It was still very relevant to society. Britain joined World War II in 1939 when Hitler's Germany invaded Poland. An estimated total of 449,700 Britons died during the war, but the overall death count is estimated at between 50 and 80 million people. An Inspector Calls was written during the final year of World War II, so all audience members would have just experienced it. Again, Britain emerged victorious, but the country was still recovering from the awful consequences of war. It is important to note that the Burling family, only 2 years away from the outbreak of World War I, are entirely unsuspecting of what is to come. Due to the two world wars, the social landscape in Britain was completely altered between 1912 and 1945. During the World Wars, men of all backgrounds were conscripted, which means they were forced to fight. This meant that upper, middle and working class men were marching and fighting together on the battlefield, helping each other out and experiencing the same hardships. On the home front too, in order to avoid running out of food and resources, the government issued ration books to all citizens. Ration books were ways of tracking how much each person was consuming to avoid the country suffering famine. Every person received the same food rations, and working class people received subsidies on their rations, meaning the same food was more affordable to them. All of this meant that the upper, middle, and working classes lived and worked side by side for the first time. The world wars acted as a leveller between them, as people realised that they could and should help each other out. Looking back on a family like the Burlings would be interesting for an audience who had gone through this. Gender roles, too, were changed by the wars. Before the World Wars, middle and upper class women often did not work, particularly when they were married. Working class women were mainly employed in domestic service, which means maids, cooks, or nannies for middle and upper class families, or as textile manufacturers, which means making clothes and other fabric. However, because so many men had been conscripted during the wars, women had the opportunity to enter more traditionally male career paths. For example, engineering and munitions. Around 950,000 women were employed in munitions factories during World War II. The World Wars gave women the opportunity to prove their strength and ability, where previously they had been largely viewed as both physically and intellectually inferior to men, meaning that people thought they were weaker and not as clever. This changed perspectives of women. The image here is of Rosie the Riveter, an important figurehead to women who showed strength and courage on the home front. At the beginning of the play, Arthur Burling lectures the other characters about the state of the country and the future. This is particularly important because Priestley has chosen to set the play in the past. For example, Arthur says, "The Titanic! She sails next week. Unsinkable. Absolutely unsinkable." This was a common view of the time, as the Titanic was supposed to be unsinkable. However, as the audience knows, the Titanic sank just a week later. Arthur also asserts, "The Germans don't want war. Nobody wants war." Again, as the audience knows, the Germans fight Britain in 2 world wars over the next 30 years. Finally, Arthur predicts, "In 1940, there'll be peace and prosperity and rapid progress everywhere, except of course in Russia." The 1940 audience, still feeling the effects of World War II, may be particularly unhappy with this blind prophecy. These are examples of dramatic irony, the device of giving the audience more information than the characters have for dramatic effect. Because the audience knows more than Arthur about the state of the country and what will happen in the future, they are able to cast judgment on his opinions and see that he lacks a basic understanding of the world around him. He speaks as if he has great knowledge, yet he fails to foresee the most influential war in British history that takes place just 2 years after this. He also criticises Russia for being behind, while it is Russia that makes the first steps towards communism in the revolution of 1917. As a socialist, Priestley was very interested in Russia's political progress. Why does Priestley decide to set an Inspector Calls in 1912? Remember, writers always have a reason for the choices they make. Where possible, try to imagine what these reasons could be. As it is evident from the timeline, the time between 1912 and 1945 was turbulent and ever-changing. Due to the change in attitudes, the political landscape in Britain had shifted to the left with the election of Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee by a landslide in 1945. British society in 1945 looked totally different to that of 1912. It could be argued that 1912 was the last year of relative stability. Because 1912 was a relatively stable year, the class system was fairly rigid, women were afforded few rights, and those with money were comfortable. This was the perfect time to explore the morality of a family like the Burlings. Would they choose to become socially responsible, or would this only change through force? Priestley wanted the audience to consider this question. Remember, knowing the context of a piece of literature is vital to understanding its influences, intentions, and impact, so take notes. 1912 and 1945. Society in 1945 was very different to that in 1912. Between the 2 years, the world wars took place. The wars acted as a leveller between the upper, middle, and working classes. Women challenged expectations by taking up masculine work. The audience can see that Arthur's predictions are false, and Priestley wants to explore how far society has come and how far there is left to go.